were not here on Thursday and Wednesday and Thursday, you missed 2 excellent lectures. But the good thing is we have now today and tomorrow, and this prompts to be even better lectures, I've been told by Brian. I will not waste any more words. Brian is the speaker. So Brian, please go ahead. And
Thank you very much, Jan. What I want to do today is talk about a movement or a change in economics that, as far as I can see, is taking place, and I've been deeply involved in this. We call it complexity economics. I want to start fairly arbitrarily. There's a very good economic historian of thought called David Colander at Middlebury University. And in 1996, Dave Colander came out with this allegory. It's a story. He says, imagine there are 2 very high mountains, maybe 100 years ago, and all the economists are gathered at the bottom of this mountain, whenever, 1850 or something like that, these 2 mountains, and they're wondering which one they should climb. They want to climb the higher one, the more interesting one. But both mountains are shrouded in cloud, and they don't know which one is higher. One of the mountains, turns out, has a jungle down below, so it's hard even to get a purchase on this mountain or to approach it. The other one has a nice concrete pathway leading up to it. So they choose the mountain that looks much more accessible. Colander calls this the mountain of order and well-definedness. It's really, this is the pathway that economics took. And so that the economists go up this mountain of order and well-definedness and equilibrium, and everything's very nice. They come through the cloud layer. They reach the top of this particular mountain, and they discover above the cloud layer, they see the top of the other mountain. It's much higher and much more interesting and has very good outlook, but that's not the mountain they climbed. That other mountain you could call the mountain of ill-definedness, the mountain of organicism, showing you maybe what the economy would be like if you looked at it organically or almost biologically, but they didn't climb that mountain. And Colander comments that now, when he was writing 20 years ago or so about this, we're just starting to notice this other mountain and just starting to climb it. But you have to hack your way through the jungle even to begin to climb it. This is what I want to talk about this morning. And I think a good place to start is with a conference I went to in 1985 in Brussels, organized by Ilya Prigozhin, who I've mentioned several times in these lectures. I can't even recall what the title of the conference was, but essentially we didn't use the word complexity much in those days, but it was about complex systems. Prigozhin would have called these non-equilibrium non-equilibrium systems. I met someone there, and I noticed my research diaries. I met someone called Steve Kaufman, realized I'd got the name wrong. It was a younger guy anyway, called Stuart Kaufman, who I'll mention later on. And I was greatly taken by a talk by Peter Allen. Peter Allen was with the Brussels group, with the Prigozhin group, and he co-authored a paper and talked about it. The other author was Jacqueline McGlade, who is high up now in environmental systems in the EU, and routinely she pilots helicopters, bringing people to see the melting of the glaciers in person in the middle of Greenland. So Peter Allen and McGlade had come up with this research. The research was on fisheries. and they were connected with real fisheries. It was an interesting piece of work, and for me, quite novel and even a bit strange. What they were talking about is, they said, let's imagine a real fishery. Fish aren't all over the place. They're in very specific regions or very specific locations. There might be a big fishing fleet or a couple of big fishing fleets coming out of some port. That might be several hundred fishing boats. And I said, imagine there are some people, some class of skippers, and he called them Cartesians. These were the people who didn't take much risk. These were people who wanted to know, we know in the past there's fishing stocks in this location or in that location. So we'll play it safe and go there. Once they go there, they tend to stay there. The other group of skippers he calls stochastic or probabilistic types. These are the cowboys of the system. They take risks. They tend to range free. They're not tied down. They're exploring, and they're looking for new schools or shoals of fish. Occasionally they hit it rich and get huge catches. Sometimes they find nothing. So Peter Allen and McGlade were modeling this, and they set up quite an elaborate model. It was a spatial model. Nowadays we'd show this on a huge computer screen, but this was 1985, over 30 years ago. They had a hexagonal grid all laid out, and they had little fishing boats in the different parts of this grid. What they found was that the story they were able to tell in their simulation, it was a computer simulation, but had to be done, the visual part was largely done by hand. What they found was that the Cartesians did very well early on. They knew where the fishing stock was. They'd go out with their boats. They might sit there, and month after month or even year after year. But sooner or later, and the stochasts were out exploring, they didn't do quite as well, because quite often they'd go somewhere and there'd be no fish. Or they'd be looking around, and in general, some might hit it very lucky, many wouldn't. And they didn't do too well. But the Cartesians began to fish in the same locations, and pretty soon, within 3 or 4 years, according to their simulation, the fishing stock got depleted. And both sides were able to gather information on who was fishing where and just how much fish they were taking, maybe getting the information in real life over the radio, because boats transmit to each other and talk to each other. The Cartesians, who were doing pretty well in this simulation, just sat where they were. The information wasn't very valuable. They were doing quite well, thank you, and didn't need to move. But once the stock of fish started to get depleted, then they started to look around, what else can we do? And they start to pay attention to all of the radio traffic from the stochasts. And the stochasts, some of them had hit it lucky, and so the Cartesian people were able to figure out where the stochasts, who's doing very well, and maybe even follow them at night. And if they all set out from the same port at the same time, the stochasts might have explored earlier and found this is where we want to go. And the Cartesians would begin to follow these stochasts because they'd run out of their own opportunities. And in their simulation, the stochasts would start to try to avoid the Cartesians, because the Cartesians were stodgy. They hadn't earned very much. They hadn't done any exploration. And if the stochasts were exploring like crazy, why should they share that with the people who hadn't spent their time or effort exploring? So in the simulation and the story they were telling, boats of the stochasts would set out at the same time as their Cartesians. The Cartesians would be spying on and following some of the stochasts that they thought had been lucky. Boats would slip away at night over the horizon and couldn't be found. However, you could pick up their radio signals. Not all of this was perfectly in the simulation, but this emerged from the story. So the Cartesians started to spy on and follow the stochasts. The stochasts started to try to disappear and even fool the Cartesians. They might be sending, I'm thinking of this off the British Isles or the North Sea, they might send messages that one stochast to another, oh, well, we'll meet you next Thursday just off the Faroe Islands, which might be code for saying, we're going nowhere near the Faroe Islands, we're going to go to Canny Shields or the Dogger Bank or some other fishing region. So they were telling a story that showed spying, it showed deception, it showed lying, it showed slipping over the horizon at night, it showed false communication and false information. And amazingly enough, they had done all of this in equation form. This was 1985, with a few parameters. And I'm not saying all this human story comes out, but you could reinterpret that. I was sitting there, I'd never heard any lecture like this. It was Peter Allen talking. I just sat there and I thought, my God, I mean, nowadays, we weren't using this vocabulary then, but nowadays we'd say this was emergent behavior. You know, two types of fishing skippers, two types of behavior in standard economic models or fishing models. One would fish and the other would explore and fish and so on. But what we were seeing was all of this informational stuff and all these behaviors emerging from Allen and McGlade's model. I sat there just completely transfixed. I thought I had grown up partly in a fishing village in Ireland, and I did know a few skippers. I didn't know all of this went on, but what they were showing was all of this emergent behavior. We didn't even call it emergent behavior then, it just seemed interesting behavior. And with one strategy building on top of another, it seemed that the whole system could get almost infinitely complicated. And they had done all of this, as I said, by equation-based simulation, a few parameters, not terribly complicated dynamic equations done spatially. And all beautifully illustrated, obviously not with computer graphics. I tucked this away. I thought this is it. Why? Because there was so much more reality, and the reality wasn't built in. The reality was coming out or emerging out of the story they were telling in their mathematical model. Now, this is years before agent-based simulation. Not many years, but quite a few years, roughly 6, 7 years before we used the terms agent-based simulation. Let me fast forward a bit. I was telling you that in the last talk that there was a very important conference at the nascent Santa Fe Institute, 1987, between scientists and economists, and out of that came the idea of having a program in economics on the economy as an evolving complex system. And I was put in charge of this program. It turned out to be the one and only program at the Institute. I thought there might be 100 people there. It turned out that there was virtually nobody there except our group. And I started to collect really good people from physics or theoretical biology. David Lane, who was a probability theorist, Stu Kaufman, theoretical biologist, Richard Palmer, theoretical physicist, and so on. Really super smart people to start to investigate the economy as an evolving complex system. As godfathers of our program, we had Kenneth Arrow and Phil Anderson, Nobel Prize winners, economics and physics, and David Pines as well, a really good theoretical physicist. So we were started up. I had at the very back of my head, probably on hard disk, so to speak, some of these ideas from nonlinear dynamics, ideas from increasing returns or positive feedbacks, ideas from Allen and McGlade that I was telling you about, and some other ideas. But we really didn't know what to do. So we're sitting there kind of scratching our heads in Santa Fe, August, September 1988, gathered in the kitchen, maybe 4 or 5 of us. That's about the size we were starting out. And we sort of said, okay, we've been given from Arrow, Anderson, John Reed of Citibank, who was funding all this, we'd been given the mandate, or remit, if you want to use English, of looking at the economy from its foundations up and seeing if we could do anything different at the very foundations of economics. So what had been suggested is we should look at chaos theory, chaotic dynamics. My initial reaction, or long-term reaction, was plenty of people doing that. Forget it. By 1988, that was not news anyway. Maybe we should be looking at increasing returns. I didn't say forget it. I just thought I knew how to do that, and I'd spent a good 10 years already thinking about that. Could we go beyond that? We didn't know how. All I knew was that John Holland, who I had in my program as well, John was as smart as can be, although deceptively so, because you could meet John in a supermarket and, you know, he didn't give off these magic rays of being super bright, but John had these ideas I was talking about last time. And I thought instinctively, and several of us thought, John knows something, so we brought him out to Santa Fe, obviously, plus many others. We didn't know what to do. And we were sitting around one morning, and I remember Stu Kaufman, who didn't know anything about economics, which was to our great advantage because he had a beginner's eye. Stu says, you know, you guys do everything at equilibrium. I said, sure. That's the whole idea of a solution in economics. He says, what would it look like to do economics out of equilibrium? So drop that assumption that everything has to be in equilibrium. And my immediate reaction was, Stu, go back to your office. You know, my gut reaction was, no, thank you. You know, it's a bit like saying to a physicist, imagine there's zero gravity in the universe. What would the universe look like? Or the electromagnetic force had been reversed or something. This was so basic to our assumptions. So I didn't like it. The other economists in the room didn't like it, but it's one of these seeds you plant, and we started to think about that. I want to just give you an idea of where economics stood at the time. It was in a pretty peculiar position. Why hadn't economics looked at non-equilibrium earlier? I'll take a quote from 1983, Paul Samuelson. Samuelson was a towering figure, one of the very first Nobel Prize winners in economics, I think the second year after they gave it to a Norwegian, just to say hello in Scandinavia. Samuelson, from ex cathedra, sort of from the pulpit of economics, declares non-equilibrium is a non-starter in economics. And he used very vivid metaphor. He says, look, it might exist, but how many times, he says, have you ever seen an egg standing on its end? And so that kind of closed it off. After that, even before that, nobody wanted to talk about non-equilibrium in economics, be non-equilibrium in egg space, where all the egg could do was to fall over into an equilibrium position. This is very peculiar. fast forward again, and I got interested in heliophysics, or physics of the sun, and I realized that to first order you could say the sun's in an equilibrium as a body. Under gravity it's pushing everything in. However, there's an outward force of nuclear fusion, I hope I have this correct, pushing things outwards. But at first order, you could say the sun is in spherical equilibrium. However, if you look up close at the sun, you see mass. The sun is boiling. It's got enormous energy it's giving out, and it's giving out mass plasma ejections. There are magnetic loops coming and going. There's X-ray dark spots. There's X-ray bright spots. The sun is a hive of activity. It's roiling, it's boiling, it's seething, whatever word you want to use. The sun is like when you're boiling water in a pot. It's not just that the water has a level and then suddenly that level's somewhat disturbed, like the egg on its end. Real non-equilibrium is like water boiling or the sun boiling. Patterns and structures, magnetic loops coming and going, ejections thrown off, all kinds of things going on. But we didn't know that at the time. We just said there must be some way to do non-equilibrium economics. Maybe Samuelson's right, that if the economy is out of equilibrium, it'll very quickly restore itself. So we didn't know what to do. And the really difficult part for economists, there's plenty of theoretical economists who I respect as being extremely smart, and obviously many of them in the past had thought about non-equilibrium, although maybe they said, well, it's only a transient thing before you reach equilibrium. But what had really daunted economists was this. Let me give you the standard story first. The standard way of doing economics is to say, okay, I'm in some problem area, some system, could be like the stock market or some area of banking, and we assume that all the agents or players we're talking about, all the little people in our economic models, first of all, to make things simple, we're going to assume they're all identical. So everybody's a clone of everybody else. Next, we're going to assume that everybody knows that everybody's identical. Next, we're going to assume, this is called the common knowledge assumption, that everybody knows that everybody else is as well informed as we are. We know that everybody shares the same knowledge. We also assume people are rational, meaning they can solve quite difficult problems, possibly that economists can't solve. I don't want to make fun of this. You have to make assumptions in any science. So we're going to assume people are infinitely smart. This is in the standard story. And then we're going to let them loose in their behavior, but we're going to set up the problem so that it becomes an optimization problem that individual actors or agents can solve. So we've got a fair number of assumptions, a lot of fine print by now. So economic agents, they're all identical, they're all solving the same problem. It's an optimization problem. And we also will assume that other forces, the outcome that's created by all of these maybe realize something like change in prices, and they're all at some equilibrium where prices or other incentives are such that everything's kind of in equilibrium so that there's no incentive for anyone to change their behavior. So there's a lot of assumptions. Equilibrium in economics is a bit like equilibrium in a spider's web. There's many forces from many different things. Think of those as the threads in a spider's web. But the whole web is kind of held together by these forces, and at least with no wind, the spider's web is not changing in structure. It's in equilibrium. You could tug on one little wisp and the whole equilibrium might be changed slightly. So this is the way economists thought of problems. Perfect rationality, all problems are well-defined, logical ones or mathematical ones. The agents are smart enough to solve all such problems, and they know everybody else is doing the same thing, and the whole system is at equilibrium. Now, somebody might doubt that and say, well, okay, I'm in a system here where there's 20 other players. Maybe we're airline companies, maybe we're bidding or wanting slots for landing at Changi Airport or whatever. I know what everybody else knows and everybody's the same as me, etc. And this is a very well-defined optimization problem. And so everybody's infinitely smart, and according to the rule book, then we can all solve this problem for what would be an equilibrium solution. But what if you suspect one airline or one person out of the 20 isn't that smart? And what if you suspect they might have different information from you? And what if you suspect that you don't quite know what the other players are going to do? Suddenly this whole thing becomes unstable and this whole method starts to unravel. And then you reflect, an economist might say, well, hang on, we've got that one covered. We can have probabilities that somebody's this smart, probabilities that that number 17 is super bright, probabilities that somebody else isn't that bright. And then you're in a much more complicated world. But if you really reflect on this and you're faithful to the truth, which I believe we ought to be scientifically, if you're faithful to the truth, you will say, well, can you really say how well-informed somebody is? And economists, ones that were not much listened to, people like George Shackle, I can see one person nodding. I'd never heard much about Shackle myself. Had been pointing out, Frank Knight, John Maynard Keynes had pointed out that in many economic problems, it wasn't just that you didn't know the probabilities, you did not know full stop. Keynes said in 1937, there might be a war. When will there be a war? Because that would have a major effect on the economy. We don't know. What would be the price of copper in 3 years' time? We don't know. And it wasn't just that you could put a probability distribution. We simply don't know. Economists call that uncertainty as opposed to something that's risky or probabilistic. So there's genuine uncertainty. So go back to then, we're trying to do non-equilibrium. That'll throw you out of any equilibrium. Everybody's starting in some problem. You're uncertain who the other players are. You might be uncertain of what the government regulations are going to be. You might be uncertain who owns what. You might be uncertain as to what people intend to do. You might not know their tastes or their objectives. Huge areas of uncertainty. Problem for economics. We're willing to talk non-equilibrium. We're willing to drop all these very fixed assumptions. But what can you do? And I remember bringing this up with Kenneth Arrow. Arrow is my mentor, died a couple of years ago. I think for me, and many economists would agree, Arrow is the smartest economist we've had. I don't know if he's the most influential, but about the smartest one of the 20th century. Super, super bright. I remember saying to Ken, look, Ken, maybe agents aren't that smart. Maybe they can't solve these problems. And Ken sort of goes, he says, look, I don't disagree. He says, but what can you do? He says, what can we do? Roll back to the man I mentioned in the last talk, John Henry Holland. Holland has given this talk. I'm somewhere in the around the table, 1987. Holland is telling us how to make computer programs that play checkers or chess or anything else, how to make them smart, how they learn. How do they do that? They don't assume their opponent is infinitely smart. They don't assume their opponent knows everything. Chess is a two-person zero-sum game. In principle, you could solve it. But in practice, it's so complicated. You don't know how good your opponent is. You don't know what to expect. So John's solution to this very problem was sitting there, and John was talking about it and telling us. The way to solve that problem, says John Holland, is to give people the ability to recognize the situation they're in. In fact, dozens of possibilities of recognizing and acting. And as you play and go into different situations you're recognizing and take different actions, John had very clever ways of scoring just how good these if-then rules were. And as you started to play, and you play again and again, and you can test out these rules that his computer players, his artificial players were using, and lo and behold, they would get smarter and smarter. In fact, they could play a really good game of checkers. This was Art Samuel before even John got going. By the 1960s, by now they play a super game of chess, as you know, and now Go, with some of very similar ideas getting used. So John had the answer. These situations were not well defined, but you could set up rules or hypotheses, call them what you want. It's inductive reasoning. I think maybe this is going on. I'm in this situation. This worked last time. And the agents in our models could get smarter and smarter. And if rules weren't working, you had a big lever, there was a pit, the rule would just fall through that. And using John's other type of ideas, genetic algorithm, you could combine some of the good if-then rules and maybe their offspring, if you made a new novel rule, recognize this situation, do something that might be a combination, maybe that would be also very smart. Most of these rules turn out not to be smart, but if you watch these systems, they ramp up in smartness pretty fast. So my idea was, as I said last time, John Holland was clearly the solution. All we had to do was find the problem. Go back to 1997. John has shown us, it's like Moses coming down from the mountain. John shows us how to do this modeling in systems that are ill-defined. And I'm not thinking complexity economics. That label hadn't been given. I'm not thinking we can redo economics from non-equilibrium theory. I'm thinking this is incredible. I go back to Stanford a month later. I'm teaching a course on population and economic development at Stanford, and economic development's in my mind. I phoned John in Ann Arbor. I said, John, I've got an idea. I said, we could use your methods, and we could construct a little model in my computer here, be in my office, and we could have little agents in the model, and these little agents could be chipping away or mining obsidian, and other agents could be breeding and using and breeding flocks of sheep. And it's my idea is we start off these little guys, each one could be a computer program. I'm sure I'm not the first to think of that. There have been other people. There were people who were toying with rule-based systems at the time. But my idea was to say we could have these little guys, little peasants inside the computer. My computer was a Mac Plus. I could program haltingly in BASIC at the time. And they'll be in my office on the computer. I hit the return button. And I come back a day or two later and I look at what's happening, and these little guys with the obsidian have discovered the sheep people, and they're trading obsidian for wool. And I come back another day later and there's a little primitive currency system to make all this easy has emerged. So this is all emergent behavior, a la McGlade and Peter Allen. But it's all imaginary. I haven't programmed any of this. And then come back another day later and there's a little banking system, and 2 days later in this imaginary dream world, somehow there's joint stock companies, and there's 2 days later there's central banking, and oh my God, they've got labor unions and they've all gone on strike, and they've got insurance companies, other institutions, even a primitive legal system. And all of this has grown out from just allowing these little guys to do what they want and then hitting the return button. No other human intervention. John was enthralled, and I was sort of gung-ho on this, but I couldn't see how to do it. I really couldn't see how to do it. And by the way, years later, not very many years later, Rob Axtell and Josh Epstein managed to do something not as deep as I'm describing, but not too far off. Epstein, Axtell, sugarscape work. It was really beautiful stuff. I couldn't do it in 1987. I meet John the following June in 1988 in Santa Fe. We go to a restaurant for lunch. Restaurant's called Babes. Years later in Denver, taxi driver told me he knew Babe and told me why this restaurant owner had been called Babe. Anyway, that's all another story. But we're in Babe's restaurant, and John says, how's the idea coming for little peasants under glass, so to speak? And I said, look, John, I can't do it. And like just about everything else, these ideas sit there for years maybe, and I can't do it. I said, hang on, though, I do think there's another possibility. Maybe we could create a stock market inside the computer, and all the little agents are just buying and selling stocks. And they've got a safe asset like a post office savings account or a bank account that'll pay regular interest they know about, and they can go in and out of the market and sell and buy stocks from each other. No hookup to the actual market. There's a stock market inside my machine, Mac Plus, sitting on my desk, programmed in BASIC, and the investors are artificially intelligent little guys. Now we call them agents. And they're learning. It's not just that they have a sort of rigid buy if this. They're learning to get smarter in their investments, and they're finding out what works, and what works using John's techniques is getting noticed and scored, and they're getting smarter and smarter about what rules to use. Rules that are no good go down the chute, and new rules occasionally are injected in just to keep the thing fresh. John says, great idea. So I said, John, bring you to Santa Fe to program this. John starts to look sheepish. He's maybe one of the top computer scientists in the world. John says, well, I don't think I can program BASIC. I said to John, what can you program, John? Anyway, it turned out to be some machine, what do you call those? Assembly language, thank you very much. Some sort of assembly code from maybe the 1960s. And he did come out and work in that. And I found this, by the way, again and again and again at Santa Fe, that people that I respected, Phil Anderson was one, John Holland's another, they weren't kind of the wizards with the techniques. They were the guys, though, who had the deep ideas. So we did start to program this. Again, it was my job to design this. There weren't any agent-based models. This was 1988. How do you design a stock market that would work? I couldn't solve that one either. I tried pretty hard for many months, and I wasn't really getting anywhere. You know, by the way, if some model you're using is clean. It's like a machine falling into a groove and it goes boom. And I wasn't getting that feeling. It didn't look right to me. It was pretty ad hoc. Visiting us, we had Tom Sargent from Stanford, and Tom's a good friend. So I said, Tom, we're trying to do this or that, stock market. But I said, I don't think this is very clean. Tom looked at what I was doing. He said, why don't you use Robert Lucas's stock market model from 1978? Bob Lucas is a really bright Chicago school economist. And later, to get yet another, I keep mentioning Nobel Prizes, to get a Nobel in economics for his 1978 model and much other work besides. Here's how, so I said, that's it. We will take the standard neoclassical approach, identical agents, all the stuff I was telling you about. We will do that, and we'll put that in our computer, but we won't allow the agents to be identical. We won't assume they are infinitely smart mathematicians. We won't assume rational expectations that the forecasts they come up with have to be accurate and average. We're just going to stick them in the model and let them learn. And it can be totally random to start with. By the way, Lucas's model, and I want to say this and emphasize this, some neoclassical economics, in fact, an awful lot of it is elegant and beautiful. Bob Lucas's model was that you could read this stuff and then gasp, but it was under very heavy assumptions. And there was an embarrassment. Lucas's model was beautiful. If you gave his agents, they were just mathematical equations. If you gave those mathematical equations earnings, Lucas was interested in what's the price sequence that results. And Bob Lucas was able to solve for that in principle and to track that. But there was a not very much talked about embarrassment to this that economists, good economists, were well aware of. In an actual stock market, there's a lot of trading. In Lucas's model, everybody's identical. So at any moment, they all want to buy, or they all want to sell, and the price adjusts accordingly so that people are neutral about buying and selling. But there's no trading. That's an embarrassment. There's no volume of trade equals zero. In real markets, it could be trillions or certainly hundreds of millions in any currency. There is no psychology of the market. Everybody's identical. There is no technical trading, people looking at past prices and using that. There are no periods of very high fluctuations, which we seem to be in at the moment, followed by periods of quiescence. There are no autocorrelations between prices and a lot of technical stuff. But it was all fine. It was as if you constructed a model of a human being, and I've seen a few movies like this, where the human being's perfect, but the human's kind of is recognizably human, but it doesn't have real personality like a real market would. So we take the whole machine from Bob Lucas, we slide out the perfectly rational, perfectly identical assumptions. We just slide that part out and we slide in our own assumptions that our agents are going to be on a computer, that the agents are going to be artificial agents, little programs, that these programs may not be that smart, they'll just have rules. If the market's gone up 3 times in the last 3 periods, then expect it to go up another 1.2% or something. We put in lots of random rules. We allowed the agents to differ in which rules they might follow. We asked the agents to track the accuracy of rules, and the ones that worked well, they retained. The ones that didn't got ignored or thrown out, and occasionally there were new rules built in. So our little artificial intelligent agents were creating a stock market out of their buying and selling behavior that gave prices that they were reacting to and learning from. And we got the thing going. It took better part of a year, 1988, to get it going. Richard Palmer programmed it in BASIC on my Mac Plus. Later we transferred it to Objective-C on a Next machine that by 1990. But we got this artificial market working. And of course the big bet on, or the big question was, are we going to find anything that Bob Lucas didn't find? And so hit the return button. All these little artificially intelligent agents are getting smarter. They start to interact. They're trading like crazy. There's a market psychology. That's all the different forecasts and opinions that are out there, etc. And then we get this output like you would see in a rail market, jaggedy price sequence. We look at it, and there's no difference between that and what Bob Lucas would have found. I was really deeply disappointed. We had replicated the Lucas experiment, if you like, under more realistic assumptions, and we found nothing. That's be the end of the story here, and I could terminate the talk and say nothing happened. However, we started to look more closely, and just like a rail market, it was pretty efficient. And it looked very much like the neoclassical one, but we started to plot it against the neoclassical solution, the Lucas type. We could solve it for a Lucas type of output, and we could solve it for our output and superimpose the two. And lo and behold, there were little bubbles and crashes in ours, none in Lucas's. Just like in rail markets, there were price correlations in ours and in rail markets, but not in Lucas's. So we started to get all these emergent phenomena in our markets, periods very high volatility and then nothing happening. We started to get that, and I was back in Stanford at the time. I had a guy running this called Paul Taylor, who was from the city in London, meaning he was a finance guy, and Blake LeBaron as well. And I'd phone in to Santa Fe, what's the market doing today? And so, oh, nothing much happened. Phone the next day. How's the market go? You wouldn't believe it. It's gone wild. The reason it is going wild is occasionally our little agents would discover a better strategy. Maybe one agent or two agents, and then they'd be buying in like crazy. And then that behavior would change the market slightly, and that would outdate some of the other forecasts of the other artificial agents, so they had to change. So you got avalanches of change rippling through the system. You see that in rail markets. It's called Garch behavior. See if I can do this, I might need help. Garch, generalized autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity. They don't give Berkeley PhDs away for nothing, okay, at least. So we were seeing real phenomena that the neoclassical approach couldn't see. Took a long, we published in Physica A in 1992, but I was very pleased at that. I want to just say that as we started to look at other problems and other people took up this approach and started to look at other problems, a general logic came out. If you wanted to do an economics problem realistically, you allowed that there was a lot of uncertainty. You simply, the agents wouldn't know what the other guys were doing. They might have some pretty good idea of what they were in. Therefore, they had to explore, they had to make assumptions, They had to be inductive. They'd say, well, I think we might be in this situation, that situation. In 1991, I was working for Citibank in Hong Kong, and I'd be sitting up at 3 in the morning, because that's when the action would be taking place, with foreign exchange traders. And this greatly influenced me. This is a real world. It's like going out on a fishing boat if you're Allen and McGlade. They were sitting there saying, we don't know what's going on. And they were making real bets. The bets might be whatever, 50 million or 100 million, maybe not huge, but not small either. And they'd be saying, we're not sure what's going on. We think the New Zealand bank has just come in, and the Central Bank of China looks like it's in there now. We think this might be happening. This might be, something else might be happening. And you could see them weight these different strategies. They were recognizing the situation and then applying actions or making forecasts based on that, precisely the way John Holland taught us to look at this. So in general, in economic problems, you start with uncertainty. You allow your little agents to have maybe multiple hypotheses. You allow them to explore, figure out what works, which hypotheses are realistic at that time. Based on that, they take their actions. All the agents together lead to some aggregate outcome. And maybe that aggregate outcome negates some of your ideas, so you update your ideas. So you have a kind of causal loop. We're not doing perfect deduction. We have many possibilities. We're learning which ones work. But there's no end to that, because the agents forecasting together and using their own ideas might be producing an outcome that has changed from the original one they were trying to forecast. So the whole outcome keeps shifting. It's like in a dream, and you have to keep updating and learning. So sometimes these non-equilibrium problems would converge to an equilibrium. Often we saw they wouldn't. It just keeps going on forever. Again, back to John Holland. I said, John, do you think that, this was back in '97, sitting around with a beer, I said, John, you know a lot about chess. I take it players these days are much smarter than the ones 100 years ago. John says, no. He said, I don't think they're any smarter. But I said, they play a lot better. He says, no. He says, the game has changed. People have learned a lot about strategy in chess. They've got smarter in that sense. They're better informed, they're better trained, they know more. But that shifts the game. I said, are you telling me there's no equilibrium play in chess? And John says, no, there isn't. We are pushing out the frontiers all the time. As people get smarter, you need to update. As you update, that pushes out the frontier again if you're a master player. And so this was the kind of thing we were finding in economics. Everybody in our little market was getting smarter, but that just meant that you as a player had to be smarter too. These markets never really settled down. I think that this gave us a general approach, and I wrote this up for a paper in Science, 1999. The editor called me, if I recall, it was from London. Call came through from the editor. He says, I liked your piece. It was called Complexity and the Economy. He said, I like this. You have a whole new approach here. What are you calling it? I said, I don't know, nothing. No, he says, what are you calling it? I said, I don't know. I was standing in the hallway with a telephone. He says, no, look, you have a framework here for doing economics differently. Would you kindly give it a name? So I blurted out complexity economics. Later to regret it slightly, I think I should have called it non-equilibrium economics. And I want to, but anyway, the complexity economics name has stuck, and that's what people are doing in that regard. There's a famous quote from either from John von Neumann or Stan Ulam back in the 1940s. They were talking about non-linear mathematics versus linear mathematics. And nobody knows whether it was von Neumann or Ulam made this comment. Depending on where you read it, it's assigned to one or the other. But the comment is that we tend to think of linear systems as being huge, non-linear ones are little exceptions on the side. But let's say it's Ulam. Ulam pointed out, he says, yeah, well, that's because we're familiar with linear systems. He says, but the nonlinear ones don't have to be a small set. It's a bit like saying zoology is the study of elephants. Oh, and there's also non-elephants as well. And of course, that's just the exception. So the non-elephants, in my case, are non-equilibrium systems. And the question is, how much further are we in looking at that? I want to come to some general conclusions here. Suppose we do economics this way. What do we achieve? And one of the things I've heard is that, yeah, we can do non-equilibrium economics, and that's a kind of bolt-on. Here's the big vehicle of neoclassical economics, equilibrium economics, and we'll bolt on to the side these exceptions, non-equilibrium economics. Is it just a bolt-on? Secondly, does it matter? Well, we know pretty much about equilibrium systems. Non-equilibrium systems, well, they'll quickly form into equilibrium. So it really doesn't matter that much. I want to contest both of those ideas. First of all, I want to say this, that standard economics, it's fashionable here and there to deride economists and to deride economics and sort of say, physics is the real science, or these days, molecular biology, choose your science, computer science, mathematics, this is the real stuff. Oh, and the economists are the guys who couldn't get into the physics department. And economics, I mean, really. I completely disagree with that. There's a famous little passage in Bertrand Russell's autobiography where Bertrand Russell says Max Planck, the great physicist, in the 1800s, thought, should he go into physics or economics? And thought a bit about it and decided economics was too easy, so he wanted something more challenging. He went into physics. Bertrand Russell says he figured out, he's made the same choice. Should he go into economics like his friend Keynes or stay in logic? And thought it over quite hard and decided that economics was too complicated. There's a lot going on. There are people making decisions about what other people might do, who are making decisions what yet other people might do. So economics, for that reason, is not that simple. The standard neoclassical theory has been successful. It has given us macroeconomics, and if you think that that's trivial, now we don't get these huge depressions. We know how to control those. It's given us ways to control currency. We understand central banking. We understand the theory of monopolies. We don't have all those scourges anymore. We understand theories of insurance. In standard neoclassical economics, we understand even how to design auction markets, which are very important, say for auctioning off radio frequencies to large companies, etc. So I don't want to trivialize that. What does this non-elephant or non-equilibrium economics bring you? I want to mention 2 or 3 things just very quickly. If the economy and the banking system, the financial system is in equilibrium, by definition that rules out anything that's changing. So it can't change. By definition, your solution doesn't change. But we do see a lot of times when a banking system can get into a cascade of failures. Failures are never called failures in financial system. They're called distress. So you can have distressed assets, like dominoes. A bank gets into trouble. It has distressed assets. That means it pulls all its loans in. Oh, that puts other things in distress, other banks, other creditors, other debtors, and they're distressed too. So you get these cascades of failure rippling through the financial system. That's not imaginary. That's exactly what we had in 2008, when Lehman Brothers went down and then AIG went down, and there's a whole ripple effect, and across Europe as well, and here no doubt too. So that is ruled out. That's not an equilibrium phenomenon. It's like saying we have an equilibrium theory of traffic flow, but in an equilibrium theory of perfect traffic flow, you don't get traffic jams. Why? Traffic jams are a temporal phenomenon. They arise, they dissipate, they go away. But they're not part of an equilibrium. Therefore, you won't see them if you're only solving for equilibrium. So anything that has to do with propagation of change, propagation of innovation, propagation of novelty, propagation of trouble in the economy isn't seen in an equilibrium system. It is seen in non-equilibrium, and you can work on or model how that arises. Similarly, in an equilibrium system, theoretically, you can't game the system. You can't strategize to beat the system. Why? It wouldn't be an equilibrium. Why? If people could game a system, they would change their behavior, or they have an incentive to change. So it wouldn't be an equilibrium. An equilibrium is a system, and this is pretty subtle, where nobody has any incentive to do anything different. But hang on, the banks in Iceland in 2008 gamed the system. The electricity market in, I think it was around 2000 in California, had been freed up. That got gamed. When the Soviet system gave way to Russia, I think it was 1990, 1991, all the assets that were socially owned were given away to cronies and oligarchs. That got gamed. You don't see that in equilibrium, because equilibrium rules out those situations putatively. Nothing can be gamed if it's in equilibrium. There's no incentive by definition. So it's quite subtle. But maybe that doesn't matter. I looked into the aftermath of the Russian fiasco, which was, I wouldn't say initiated or instigated, but advised by equilibrium economists. They just said, okay, all the assets are going to be privately owned tomorrow. And how will that work out? Well, we don't know, but we know there'll be a pretty good equilibrium. Not true. They were taken up by oligarchs, and people were cut out. They didn't have their standard income. And you can see the results of that in the mortality statistics for the next 5 to 10 years in Russia. Meaning you open the mortality statistics, I'm trained as a demographer as well, you definitely see people dying, not by the 10s or 20s, but by excesses of millions, or hundreds of thousands and then millions. So these things make a difference. What about the other thing that's a bolt-on? Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Arthur. We would love to have a little conference on non-equilibrium economics or complexity economics And it is an important addition to standard economics. What about that? I think it's a bit like saying, again, go back to the known elephants. Well, you know, they're an exception to elephant country. What I'd like to point out is that non-equilibrium as a special case includes equilibrium. If you have a traffic system that occasionally has bad traffic jams, traffic's very dense, that includes as a special case, and maybe an exceptional one, the traffic's flowing freely and everything's extremely well behaved. So it turns out that non-equilibrium economics or complexity economics is much more general than standard neoclassical economics, because non-equilibrium includes equilibrium, and occasionally you see special cases. When we did this work on the stock market, our market, we had a twiddle parameter. This is something we borrowed from physics. Physical models often have a twiddle parameter, temperature or something like that. They can switch that up and down in their theoretical models. Very often they call that lambda or epsilon or something. We had a little twiddle parameter as to how quickly our agents changed or learned. If they changed very slowly, our model, with all the little artificial agents, just settles down quietly to Bob Lucas's solution. If we switch it up to the rate at which human beings actually learn, and we had data from psychologists, then it's showing all these phenomena. So real markets show these phenomena. So is complexity economics a bolt-on? I don't think so. Going back to my friend Dave Collender, Collender says, well, you know, I said on the phone, I said, Dave, where would you place complexity economics? He just said without hesitation, oh, well, that's the new general theory. And there have been plenty of people involved in this, not just Santa Fe, but plenty of other players like Peter Allen, Epstein, Alan Kerman, and many others. Once the great Prigogine sent for me, I was in Davos, and I got this imperial summons to the Sport Hotel at 3 p.m. on Friday or something. I show up, Prigogine comes down the stairs. He says, I have a bone to pick with you. And I said, all right. He says, not everything was invented in Santa Fe. I said, look, you know, if you look at the introduction to one or two of my books, I say I got my ideas out of Brussels and from Ann Arbor, Michigan, not from John Holland, not necessarily from Santa Fe. I want to finish here on a personal observation. Oh, by the way, I'd mentioned Rob Axtell 2 or 3 times. Axtell did a really interesting piece of analysis. So one question is, if complexity economics is so good, why isn't it out there? In fact, I was talking to someone about a possible job or visiting job in Oxford. The guy who runs the school I was chatting with, he said, you know, he says, you want to bring in complexity economics? Let me tell you something. I don't think it's going anywhere. I said, oh, on what grounds? He says, well, we don't see it in the textbooks, do we? And there's nobody teaching it in the top universities, is there, etc. You know, I was speechless. It turned out they didn't pay for my visit, which was local in the UK, to show up at Oxford. I was appalled. Go back to Rob Axtell. Axtell did an analysis. He says, what about all the big movements in economics? Game theory invented in the 1940s by von Neumann and Morgenstern. Behavioral economics invented in the 1960s and 70s. And he 2 or 3 others. And he calculated that it took 40 to 50 years going from the initial idea to things being accepted and then joining the core of economics. And the first place, by the way, to adopt the new ideas is always the music department, no, the business school. Why? Because business schools are interested in what works. They're not interested in theology. I'm being mean here. So he said, okay, take behavioral economics, starts up in the 1960s, gets going really in the 1970s. The first people to be adopted into the world of academia are engaged in the 1980s, 1990s, really smart game theorists in the business schools. And then he says around about the year 2000, game theory is right in the center of economics. What about behavioral economics? 1960s, I won't go through the whole thing, but the Nobel in economics, if I recall last year, was given to Dick Thaler, not the only person who invented that, but one of the key players. So, of course, I do the calculation. 1988, 1990, complexity economics. I'll be gone. And I think that some of the other initiators, John Holland is already no longer with us. But that's fine. I think it takes a while. I'm sticking my neck out here and making a very large claim. But I do think that non-equilibrium economics will become a new framework for economics. And I'm not the only person saying that. I want to leave you with one last thought. When I was growing up, age 10 to 20, I was in high school. I didn't know anything about science, but I knew I wanted to be a scientist. And I thought, well, later I thought if I was very lucky when I was in my 30s and 40s, I would have been born at the right time. Maybe born at some time and maybe in some place where I could show up, say, in 1915, 1920 in Göttingen in Germany, where quantum physics was just starting, and by dint of really good luck, I could be in the right place at the right time, and then I'd give a sigh and I'd say, that's just luck. And it was after being at Santa Fe for 10 years, 20 years, it wasn't until about 10 years ago, I've been with Santa Fe since 1987, which is 31 years. About 20 years into that, I realized I was at a place where a new science was being born. I was one of many, many players. And again, I go back to, people like Jeff West. Jan knows them all and has brought many of them out here. But it was exceptional. And none of us knew it. The atmosphere was you could do what you want, you could suggest what you want, you could say, we're going to look at ice skating or whatever, assuming there's no ice, whatever. You could do whatever you wanted. In fact, at popular request, I will leave you with this thought. So I realized I had been in a Göttingen, but I didn't know it. And I had been in somewhere where the new ideas were being laid down. I've talked about economics, but these are ideas in every science, that every science is going non-deterministic, that every science is starting to assume that problems may not necessarily be well defined, that things may not necessarily be in equilibrium, and that the world is algorithmic, meaning step by step, rather than continuous, and that algorithms are the new language rather than just equations, which of course will remain for us. By request, I wanted to tell you this fact that the last meeting we had of complexity economics of significance was in Esalen in California. I want to, Jan, if I may take a few minutes, I would love to ask Steve if he would comment on a couple of things, but feel free to just comment generally. Steve is, as you know, a superb social scientist and anthropologist. And Steve once made a reference in one of his talks that anthropology is sort of equilibrium science, but maybe not, and maybe it's embracing non-equilibrium. The other thing is that Steve, among the many things he's done, is classic work on irrigation systems that are highly interconnected in Bali, not just finding out how they work, but being able to reproduce this incredibly complicated system of rice farmers talking to other rice farmers and talking to people who run these irrigation systems and water temples who are priests, and laying down a whole system maybe for the last 1,000 years. Steve was able to get these sorts of systems on his computer as emergent, and that would be what sort of equilibrium emerges. But again, as I've been saying, you may never reach an optimum. So I've given the punchline here, Steve, but I'd love you to comment on non-equilibrium in general and your own work.
Thank you, Brian. How nice to have that chance. Two comments. First, there's a difference between complexity economics, complexity and non-equilibrium. The difference is very relevant to me. When we began to build agent-based models in Santa Fe, one direction was to make them bigger and bigger. See if you could get more and more agents, 1 million agents, 10 million agents, and to add more and more detail. That still goes on. It was very popular in archaeology. Add more parameters. That's with the goal of finding the equilibrium solution. You keep adding parameters until you've found the equilibrium. That's different than looking for whether there might be other equilibrium, whether there might be more than one, right? So non-equilibrium, to open that possibility, we went a different direction. My colleagues and I, we started out modeling irrigation systems in Bali, rice, and people making decisions. 1,000 years. There are hundreds of articles every year on rice. It was all terribly complicated. Our method was to strip away the complexity, step by step, as much as possible until we could reveal the dynamics. And that really has kind of worked. Like you here and I have been working this year on a model. We finally came down to a 2-dimensional lattice with 2 parameters with which we can reproduce the patterns that you will observe in Google Earth. If you look at Bali in Google Earth and you look at the way in which the rice terraces have been irrigated, there's a pattern, there's a mosaic. We can explain that with a model that consists of 2 parameters. And now Stefan Turner, who was here last week, is going to Santa Fe. He's on his plane, right, to talk to the guy who builds 1-dimensional models to see if we can get it down that far. Why do that? Because we're trying to capture the underlying dynamics, what actually works. Because then we can generalize. Does the same phenomenon that happens in Bali happen elsewhere? And our bet is that it is. So that paper is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences from a few months ago. My other point is I'm going to give Brian a little bit of a hard time because I think complexity economics is clearly the way to go. But if we continue, for economists, the environment is an externality. The reason is they need prices and costs. So what is the price or what is the cost? What's the value of the iron that is delivered by the rivers of the world to the oceans, which makes photosynthesis possible, which gives us an oxygen atmosphere? All right, that's an externality. If we keep up the current, if economists remain in charge for a few more decades, the ecologists will tell you by 2050 the world's oceans will be more plastic than fish. If we continue to extract the fossil fuels, if we take the North Sea and the Arctic and we pump all that stuff up into the atmosphere, the oceans will become acidic. I mean, you know all those things, right? That's not part of the framework for economics. If you do game theoretical models in economics and you ask what's the environment consists of the other agents, It's contained, okay? So for an anthropologist, this looks less and less like a good idea. That it happens that us social primates have decided that we're going to manage the world in terms of the subjective value to us of everything on the planet. You cannot measure price, right? Yeah. There's no measurement possible. It's purely subjective. So we've got a problem, and I'm hoping that Brian will lean in that direction and think, not only do we need to look for different attractors, calculate basins of attraction, understand non-equilibrium systems, make it possible to look for them, but we also need to open the box a little further and say, what are the interactions that make economics possible, those resources? So, okay, Brian, it's to you now.
Amen. I completely agree. In fact, Steve and I are off to a meeting in Sweden next week. I'm leaving tomorrow for this thing, where we're going to talk to people there from the Bayer Institute and the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Swedish Academy about complexity and the environment. My comment is this, that the history of economics over the last couple of hundred years has been to do with thinking about the system, and initially very generally, how does society operate, what sort of institutions do we need, up to about 1850. Then it narrowed considerably, but in the last 2 or 3 decades, it's been expanding again, and I think there's a lot of work economists are doing thinking about the environment. And so economics is thinking about non-equilibrium, about non-linearities, about multiple equilibria, and about gaming systems and so on. And it's starting to think, not enough, but it's starting to think about the environment. There's one assumption I want to get rid of, though. I think it's totally pernicious, and Steve mentioned it. It's that the environment somehow is here for us. It's not. The value of doing this or that is the effect it would have on human beings. Such nonsense. That comes out deeply out of our Western culture. I'm not saying it's not in other cultures, but I'd love to see that assumption go. The environment has its own value intrinsically, even if there wasn't a human on the planet. And so I completely agree with you. As economists, we could do more. Okay. We have at least one environmental scientist in the audience. I'm sure there's...
All right.
Please ask Steve questions. If they're hard questions, ask Steve.
It's open for questioning, in other words. That's, go ahead.
When Brian was start talking, I was start to think about Singapore just gone through the select committee on fake news and so forth. So how would we then model information?
Can you speak in the microphone?
Whether information that is true, with a bit of perturbation, it changes. So if we can't, is it a big mockery that we even thinking of passing a law, one way or the other? Think about that. Now, I give you a very common layman language. Perhaps I produce a drug, and come here, Vincent, I pass to him, it's a skin drug and it works. The next moment, he put it in the net and market it. Okay? Someone come around and say, look, this drug is only work for certain temperature, certain age. So, is his claim of that information true or false? Now, what is true anymore? And what is false? Now, that have certain bearing, certainly for econ or any other discipline. I want to hear both of your comment on that. How would you take all this equilibrium or non-equilibrium theory into that? Thank you.
I have a very quick comment, and that is that we have a kind of model in our minds in economics where we see we can control the economy is the idea, and the actual economy is like a huge big power station. It's behind a huge panel you can see, or a railroad yard, whatever, and you can push this lever and turn that dial, turn this wheel, and there's dials, and we hope to optimize all that. And then things change and we have to readjust all the dials and levers to get it right. I don't think that's the case. I think we're beginning to realize in economics that the economy is more like a wildlife range, possibly in Alaska or Borneo or somewhere, where there's species we hardly even know about, there's interactions we don't know about, and we're hoping that as park rangers, we can help out such a situation. But I don't think that there's any way we're going to optimize and get it right. If you look at past government policies in any country, anywhere, be it China or America or anywhere in Europe, we don't get it right very often. We're trying to cope. And I don't want to be defeatist. I just think that we need to say we're open to the idea that we haven't got it right. We may have to come in and do something very different. And so, and this goes back to Steve's point that there could be multiple equilibria, and we don't even know which one. So you want to make sure that if you're comfortable in this equilibrium, you want to be sure that you robustify as best you can where we are now, and we're not doing that.
I think as I was hearing you talk about the non-equilibrium and stuff like that, it just came to mind like platform businesses like Amazon, like eBay, like Airbnb and Alibaba. When you talk about common knowledge, yeah, it seems like, you know, you can see what the other sellers are selling, what's the selling price, and yet at the same time you see on these platforms there are similar products going for different prices, and there are buyers going for these different products. So yeah, my first comment is to whether you have also observed this in platform businesses, this non-linearity or this equilibrium economics. And my question is that as we now talk about platform businesses and network economy like Ubers and people and companies of the likes rising to eminence, we also face this question about how do we measure the cost and value of such businesses. Like traditionally, we use revenue, we use like manpower to measure like value add to the economy for enterprises. But then increasingly, I mean, when we look at these platform businesses, they might not employ as many people, but they affect the life of an ecosystem of people. So how do we go about using complexity to better ascertain it?
That's a question for Steve. No, I just mean it's a difficult question. I'll give you a quick answer, but maybe Steve has an answer. I'm very wary of anything that uses the word value. You know, what's the social value of Uber? It depends who you're talking about. You know, what's social value to taxi drivers of Uber? What's social value of shareholders or whatever that would be? We've entered a new era in which computation and online servers are giving us, as you say, platforms, and that's brought us into a new game. The particular game is one basically of information, and you would think that there'd be an instant wipe out of any price differences, but there isn't. Yesterday I was booking a hotel in Palo Alto. I got a quote on bookings.com, $200 plus a night, and Travelocity gave me $163 per night, same hotel, same room, same everything. I think that what we are assuming in economic models is that people are perfectly informed, people gather information, people gather all information, they do all comparisons, but they don't. If you want to say people are smart, I'm smart enough to know that, no, this may be wrong, I'm smart enough to know that if I get into bookings.com and I find a price, I think, oh, that must be the cheapest price. Why? My inner economist tells me if there were a cheaper price out there, the platform I'm looking at, bookings.com, would have brought their price down, but they didn't. So my assumption's wrong. What's more likely to be correct is that there's enough people like me who only look at one option or two options, and we take the first thing that comes along. We're in a different game. We need more realistic assumptions.
Thanks, Brian. Should I stand? Sure. So across the 3 lectures, it seems to have come up that the 2 disciplines that have interacted the most in complexity economics is physics and economics. And so you can comment on that, whether or not that's a fair statement to make. And then my question is, what would you say economics has learned the most from physics, and what has physics learned the most from economics? And maybe throw in other fields if you like, ecology, epidemiology, if you think there's something interesting there.
Well, Steve, why don't you? I've got a comment, but if you want. All right. I thought it should be clear from what I said, actually, that there was one other discipline that we've learned a huge amount from, and that's biology. And biology, meaning this, if you have people exploring, as I just said, certain actions or certain forecasts and changing their ideas, their actions are being tested in an ecology consisting of other people's actions. So you get evolution coming out, I'm evolving my ideas, they're getting selected by the system, and I'm in an ecology of other people's forecasts or ideas or strategies. So we learned a huge amount from biology, much more than physics. I've been reading biology now for, I don't know, close to 40 years or more, serious biology. And the biologists, I'm glad to say, are reading what we do. They're bringing back stuff from economics. The original Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest, he borrowed that from Thomas Malthus. And he explicitly says, and I was reading for amusement one night, Thomas Malthus, and it came to me that. And there it is. It's in his notebooks, in his autobiography. So what I'm seeing now is that it's not so much that we're learning from these disciplines of the 1950s, it's more that all disciplines, physics, economics, and biology, and computer science, and mathematics, are regarding the world as more experimental, more ill-defined, more organic, one thing builds on another, and more interactive. And that's why this new approach of complexity is coming to the fore. It's not rocket science, it's just the natural way of looking at things. People in the great Rutherford, the physicist, around the turn of the last century, derided biology and other sciences. I have great respect for him. But he said, there's physics, and then every other science is just stamp collecting. So many butterflies, this species, and so on. Not true. Even physics is starting to think of things ecologically, or at least in terms of an ecology.
Maybe just add, clearly statistical mechanics has had a big influence on economics because it works. You can make money understanding markets using statistical physics. Those are the quants. So, that's been, a lot of physics has been, the physicists are going to Wall Street, have been for years now. Okay.
Raymond Kwok here. I got 2 questions to ask, basically. I represent Oxford Economics, which is basically the largest econometric group there. And how do we bundle in what you are developing into what they are doing? Because we're developing models to basically project into the future. Yeah. I'm sure that there's a lot of things that we can do. Second, I also represent one of the world's largest Forex strategy, which is rest in Boston. And we use a mathematician, I'm a mathematician, we use Bayesian theory, basically to predict what is happening, and use, if we predict it right, we add it into the formula to predict further. Is that a way to collaborate, or how do we sort of work together?
What I'm learning, by the way, I was offered a job as a quant in 1991, this is quite a long time ago, before all these physicists went to Wall Street. I think that what I learned more than anything is that if you're trying to predict an economy or the foreign exchange, exchange rate of currencies, Forex, we tend to have the standard thing is to have large models and to sort of dynamic general equilibrium models and look at those. But now I think we're giving way to saying there are different players in the system. Perhaps we can model those on the computer, and we can use systems that will inductively learn, meaning they may have this hypothesis and that hypothesis and another one, and they're starting to learn what's appropriate in each situation. Much better than that, I'm not sure you can do. So it depends on how much information you can feed into the system.
So Stephan Turner was here the other day. He and his colleagues developed a model of to attempt to reduce, or in fact eliminate, systemic risk from bank loans. And Mexico has adopted this system. So essentially, if you got all the banks in a network, and you can calculate the systemic risk posed by any particular loan, then you can impose a tax proportionate to that. And in this way, you can, in the agent-based model that they've discovered, that they've created, you can drain the risk very low in the financial system. And I remember when he gave that talk in Vienna a couple of years ago, he said, yep, the economists the traders must hate you because you're taking the punch bowl away. And he said, yeah, but the regulators love me, so total love is conserved. Anyway, it works. It works, at least it works enough for Mexico. It's published now, it's available, that model. So that's gets also to your earlier question, or your question, I think, right? Are there ways in which you can try to calculate the social costs of policies and make some, actually quantitatively evaluate the social costs of some things and then make policies that are responsive to that? And in this case, it looks like you can. At least that's the claim.
I'd add to this that it's a beautiful piece of work, by the way, Stephan Turner's work on systemic risk. But one thing I want to add is not just looking at the risk that an individual lender or bank might be undertaking. He's looking at, if they get into trouble, how many other institutions will they cause to get into trouble? And you can't do that in an equilibrium setup. So inherently, Stephan Turner has discovered a way to take the propagation of risk into account. And this is very much a complexity way to look at things. And I may take on some slightly risky financial thing. It's not just that I might get in trouble. What sort of difficulties am I going to cause the entire system? That's novel, and he wants to tax banks or financial people, not just on how badly they might do, but on what trouble they cause down the line. I read this thing and I thought, oh my God, this is smart.
Hi. Okay. I'm thinking back to your story about how you thought up how to model the entire economy based on sheep farmers and obsidian miners, right? And how that propagates into the entire modern economic system. So one of the things that I've been wondering, right? And I'm still a newbie to agent-based modeling, so I'm not very sure of whether this really makes sense. But so based on the various modeling methods, right? If we understand how the structure of the system works, we can basically model how the individual actor behaves and the various variations of how how the permutations might happen, right? But what if the rules of the system change? What if the structure changes? Can we still model that?
Well, part of what you want to model is how the structure will change. And the answer is, you can, of course. That, let me refer you to something else. And if you don't think I'm answering your question, I'll look back in a moment. All of economics, standard neoclassical economics, is what I would call noun-based. There's a level of prices for this. Think of these as the amount of liquid in some little test tube going up and down. Level of prices, level of outputs, level of investments, interest rates. These are all little levels that are going up and down in some gigantic row of test tubes. These are nouns. But the economy you're describing is verb-based. What have I can invest, I can forecast, I can take action, I can buy, I can sell. Those are all verbs. And not just, you say, so what? But if I take this action, it triggers a number of other actions of other players. And so I think that what we need is an economics that recognizes verbs as well as nouns. It recognizes that actions can cause a cascade of further actions. This is true in biology at the cellular level. Meiosis or mitosis, these are processes where one thing gets completed and triggers other processes. And that's why, to go back to this, are we just basing all this on physics? The real inspiration is cellular biology, molecular biology, and genomics, genetic regulatory networks, that actions trigger actions that switch on this. And so we're beginning to think of the economy not as just levels of things going up and down, and then you ask where will they finish up. That's an equilibrium, no incentive to change. But we're thinking of things triggering things in some huge Boolean network of, if this is true and that's true and this isn't true and that's not true, or that is true, then do such and such. This is true right across the sciences. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm basically saying what's happening in economics, the reason I think this isn't going to go away soon is that we're bringing in actions, we're bringing in forecasts. I forecast, he forecasts something different based on something. We're bringing in strategies. If this is true and that's true, I'm going to do such and such. I will do. Those are all verbs. And so economics in that sense, it's not that there's little plants now growing out of economics and we've gone biological. It's that the logic is becoming much more if this, if that, and something else, then this. Doesn't answer all questions, but it's a step forward.
So I have questions in roughly two areas. One is in the state of the art of one is in the state of the literature in non-equilibrium economics. That is, what do we get out of an improved knowledge about non-equilibrium economics, and what is the next frontier for non-equilibrium economics? The second question is, economists make a lot of assumptions, and I'm wondering, where do economists get all their assumptions from? I mean, I'm a sociologist, and a lot of my assumptions come from talking to people, looking at people, and I'm wondering, given my limited understanding of economists, they don't do all that kind of thing. And I'm thinking, would we have a better economics model if economists develop their assumptions differently?
Well, I'll take that second. Would we have a better economic model if economists use different assumptions? Well, yes, that's essentially what I've been saying for the last hour or so. We don't need to assume perfect rationality. We don't need to assume equilibrium. We don't need to assume that everything's deductive. We don't need to assume problems are well defined. What we're assuming instead is that people are, I wouldn't say bungling their way forward, but they're kind of making their way forward like we all do in life. Try this idea, try that idea, and start to learn what works. But then the whole system shifts because everybody's doing that, so you have to change in something else. As to where this non-equilibrium or complexity economics is heading, your other question, and is it valid and where's it taking us? I want to point out this. I made a realization, I don't know, maybe not that long ago, 5 years ago, that there are two great problems in economics. You can put all economics in two big baskets. One is what economists call allocation problems. You know, what's the pattern, the equilibrium pattern of international trade theoretically? How does pricing work on the stock market theoretically? How are people going to allocate their money between buying stocks and putting them in other assets? These are all allocational problems. All of those problems have been well solved, they're well understood, they're highly mathematized, because those are all noun problems of things reaching an equilibrium. The other big basket of problems I call problems of formation. How does innovation work? How do economies develop? How does structure change? I think, which is what you're asking. How do things in general bubble up on the economy? So these are questions of formation. How does the economy create and recreate itself? How does technology come into an economy and create an economy, which is what I want to talk about in the next talk. These are all questions of formation. They were all looked at up until 1870 by really smart people. And I'm not a big fan, policy-wise, of Karl Marx, but I went back and read what he had to say about technology. He had gone to textile factories. He was talking about bobbins, real stuff. So the question is, these problems of formation couldn't be mathematized. They're not test tube problems because we keep getting new test tubes, new things, new actions, new structures. How do institutions come about? And they couldn't be easily mathematized, so they were largely ignored. They lost prestige, and they became the province of a rather sad group called either institutional economists or political economists. Here's the good thing. What we're looking at is how things form. How do markets form? How do they change? How do structures form in the economy? How do new institutions come about? How does the stock market take on a psychology? How does that form? How does it change over time, etc.? And coming from a complexity viewpoint, we can rigorously model that if we're willing, maybe not just have equations, but have algorithms doing this for us. And in doing so, we meet these other people, the political economists. So I got this huge thrill at saying, oh my God, we've done all this work in complexity economics, and we're meeting a group of people who are long dead, the political economists, and the ones that are still alive. Some of them are skeptical, naturally enough, but the thoughtful ones are saying, oh wow, we can be highly rigorous as well. Steve, you have to comment on this.
I just say bravo. You know, that's what we do, right? Don't you think? Bravo? Bravo.
Tomorrow I'll be talking about technology. If you're an economist, don't go away, because it's all about how that forms an economy.
Okay, well, thank you all very much again. I hope you'll all be back tomorrow. Well, hope to see you back. Thanks a lot,
Thank
Brian.
you.
Thanks a lot, Steve. And thanks a lot, all of you.
I'll be back tomorrow.
You'll be back tomorrow. At least that's good. All right.
Oh, thank you.